and having an element of hedonism, but also an element of rationalism, and they all kind of join together in this perpetual struggle.
This podcast is just a series of you denying basic philosophical axioms from all of history.
Hey, welcome to Owls at Dawn. We are just two dudes from Southern California who studied philosophy, politics, and religion around the world, and we decided to start a podcast where we could bullshit with impunity. I am Austin Hayden Smith.
And I am Troy Polidori.
And rumor has it that it's really hot where Troy is. So I told him before we started that real men podcast naked. So if you agree with this sentiment, tweet us at owls_at_dawn. And thumbs up for yes for that. Because I always podcast naked. Even if I have a shirt on, my pants at least are off.
You do basically everything naked, so that doesn't really count.
It makes things way more difficult when you're in a cold climate like Dublin, too. Like, in Southern California, I just walk around topless all the time, and that's fine, because it's kind of just accepted. But here, first of all, people don't do that, so they think that I'm like a douche if I do that. I'm like, no, you don't understand where I'm from. It's okay to walk around shirtless.
You don't understand my culture, all right? Cultural relativity.
Yeah, exactly. And not only that, but it's generally cold here, so it's hard to walk around topless. But, all right, let's get into it, huh?
Yeah, so our first segment is the Shitty Minute. This is where one of us rants and raves about whatever's grinding our gears this week. Austin, what's got you all twisted up inside?
Here, I have an event that took place, and I have no clear thoughts formed about it because I've been so busy, so I haven't really been able to think much about it other than feel my annoyance at this particular event. So this is just going to be verbal vomit. You ready? Troy, did you see the quote-unquote Sokol-style hoax that was all over the interwebs this past week?
Yeah, so quick preamble. I was very upset that you had the Shitty Minute this week because I wanted it for this very reason, and I knew this would be your Shitty Minute. So please, take the floor and take care of it for me.
Okay, well, I feel like both of us, this is going to be a dual Shitty Minute then, okay? This is the first time, because all I'm going to do is this is basically what happened for people that need to understand a little backstory. So an article was recently published in an obscure pay for review open access journal by two well-established scholars. So they didn't need to do this. They didn't need to publish in this article. But these two well-established scholars who are rationalists, who are hardcore atheists, part of kind of like that new atheist tradition, the Dawkins, Hitchens, even though I like Hitchens to some degree, but there's sort of like dogmatic atheist tradition. Guys like Michael Shermer and the rationalist crew, right? These two guys, I can't even remember their names right now. What's the one guy? Jamie
I don't
something.
remember their names.
I can't even remember their names
but
right now.
It's the crowd that thinks that all identity politics is hogwash and everything should be rationalist and not include any of that stuff.
Yeah, I think one of the dudes is like an evolutionary psychologist or something like that. I can't remember. But anyway, they published an article in in a journal that would be an open access humanities journal that would be interested in, gender studies, queer theory, postmodern critique, et cetera, et cetera. And this article was, in their own words, a nonsensical, jargon-laden piece of just nonsense, talking about what they called the sort of the violence or the problems of what they termed the conceptual penis. So they
Which
created
would be a great
this
band
concept.
name, by the way.
Conceptual Penis.
There should be a Riot Girl punk band called Conceptual Penis.
Conceptual Penis. So they created this concept that they called the conceptual penis, and they argued throughout that the conceptual penis is actually causing all of these damaging sort of forceful masculine tendencies in the West, and that needs to be eschewed. And, one of the terms that they develop is something called manspreading. And it's this idea that when men sit with their legs wide open, that is a sort of conceptual metaphor for like the masculine imposition of patriarchy over the world.
It's a microaggression for sure, man.
Yeah, a microaggression, right? And then they try to extrapolate onto how this actually works in climate science, and that actually the idea of the sort of like capitalist extraction and plunder of natural resources is a result of the conceptual penis being embedded in the activity of sort of socioeconomic activities and shit like that. So, but anyway, they then published this. In this journal, a very obscure journal that nobody knows about, that is like dying on its own just to get people to publish, so much so that you have to like pay to actually publish it.
It was like $600 or something?
Yes, I don't know how much it was. It's ridiculous, whatever it was. It was a few $100. And then because the journal made it through a couple rounds of peer review, and it ended up getting published in this journal, they then posted some sort of thing on like Skeptic Magazine or whatever the fuck it was, talking about how they performed like this great hoax on gender studies and how it was just this nonsensical jargon-laden article that nobody understands. And if you claim to understand it, then you're lying because nobody understands that. And how what they've done is they've made like a two-prong attack. One on the sort of nature of academic journals, which is actually, I think, a valid criticism, so we can talk about that. But two, the other point is that gender studies has been debunked, because if you can just write a nonsensical, jargon-laden article that has no basis in facts whatsoever and talk about something that's obvious, like the penis, in a way that is so ridiculous and abstracted, then that proves that gender theory is just a discipline of nonsense, and so it shouldn't be taken seriously. So they proved in their mind that they have debunked gender theory completely, and they have debunked all of these sort of postmodern mumbo-jumbo ideas in sort of their own words. I'm paraphrasing, but that's the gist of it, right? And these guys are fucking morons.
Wait a minute. Just to recap real quick. I didn't actually read the article because I believe in things. But
right.
Did you say that they one of their examples for the conceptual penis idea is plundering of natural resources, is like the penis going into the Mother Nature's vagina and drawing out the oil? Was that it?
Yeah, it was something along. I don't know if it was so explicit in the metaphor. I don't know if the metaphor went quite that far, but it may have. It may have. But it definitely tried to make a correlation between the conceptual penis as being embedded in the problems of the environmental crisis.
You mean inserted?
Inserted, yeah, exactly.
So here's my question.
Quite literally.
This is a very serious academic question, and perhaps I'll write an article about it and publish it in the same journal when someone lends me $600. If the conceptual penis is used to draw out the various natural resources that are embedded in Mother Nature's vagina, does that count as poo play?
Oh, absolutely.
That's what the oil is, right? It's the waste product. Exactly. That's poo play. I'm not really sure. Maybe the extraction of gold or diamonds would be golden showers. That seems a little too literal.
Does that work?
I'm not sure that similarity works.
It's a little too literal? Okay. And oil, as in like the black resource, isn't almost too literal?
That similarity was just accidental. It's not part of the substance.
Okay.
I'm just thinking like the burning of fossil fuels then for energy would then be basically like taking a shit on somebody's like stomach, right? That'd be the idea.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, the Cleveland steamer. Yeah, I think that's about right.
I just want to clarify that. Yeah, we're about serious academic research on this podcast.
It is important that we do our research here. But okay, so there were two things though. One of the things is, I think, more that we can probably talk about that's more interesting is their sort of supposed takedown of gender studies, that they have quote unquote debunked it, right? And shown it to be just a ludicrous discipline. That's one issue. I'm not as interested in that right now because I feel like that would be more, Troy would have maybe something to say about that. My interest is actually in the other prong of their attack, which was against the academic system itself. And I want to say that part of me gets angry that they would do something like this. These are respected academics. I believe that the one guy, I can't remember his name, I believe he's a tenured academic who, what he is doing and what they are doing is they are engaging in a sort of divide and conquer of the academic discipline by attacking a struggling journal that needs people to contribute to it because of embedded pressures within the academic system itself that demand a certain rate of publication, that are holding people hostage to this system of tenure, that you have to publish a certain amount in certain respected journals or in certain peer-reviewed journals in order to get tenure. So people are held hostage, and what they're doing is they're attacking that, and then they're mocking it rather than trying to come alongside the community of people that they embed themselves within as supposedly existing within the marketplace of ideas, the grander Western liberal ideas of trying to seek progress in a post-Enlightenment world. And what they're doing is they're actually engaging in a sort of postmodern nihilism themselves, because there is no substance of any positivity that they're actually offering in its stead. They're just simply taking and tearing down. And I think that is a serious problem. And while I understand that there is a problem in the academic community that needs to be addressed, that these journals exist, and that there is a problem with the peer review system, and that there is a problem with the pressures to publish, the way they went about it, I think, is actually really damaging. Like, I think it actually is genuinely damaging to the community of academics that need to stand in solidarity together to fight against these structural pressures. So that's really my frustration. Troy, what's your take on this situation?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you that there's, the one side of the argument is, did they actually engage in any legitimate critique? And I think that's kind of laughable, given the status of the journal and the fact that they had to pay a bunch of money to get it published and all that stuff. Yeah. It's kind of stupid. Like they basically themselves got hoaxed.
That's exactly right. They're like, oh, we hoaxed these people, motherfucker. You paid $600, you dumbass, to be in like an obscure journal. It'd be like, it wasn't like it was like the British Journal of Phenomenology or something like that.
Yeah, it's like if someone came to your house selling vacuums and like they charged you $500 for it, and it didn't even it was a mechanical vacuum and doesn't even have like an electrical cord to it and doesn't actually do anything. It's one of those toy vacuums that has like balls that pop up. Kids like run around with, and then you buy it for $600, and then you take a video of yourself trying to vacuum and it doesn't work, and they're like, "Ha! I caught the vacuum salesman. He's not a true vacuum salesman. I've proven it." Well, I mean, okay,
but the dude meanwhile is walking away. He's got his $500.
Yeah, he's at the club, right? You don't give a shit about
right.
You.
Yeah.
So that's totally stupid, obviously. But I think you're right that the more important point, other than laughing at kind of how dumb these people are to think this is an actual legitimate critique, is that there's some truth to the fact that academic journals, and maybe especially in this kind of leftist philosophical tenure, although I don't want to speak too much to other disciplines, does have a problem of way too much shit getting published. And that goes back to this, both the pay to publish scheme and, even more important, the publish or perish scheme, which is you have to publish a certain amounts to receive tenure. And you're encouraged to publish things that just fit into a status quo and they don't challenge anything or talk about any really important controversial questions. Just pass whatever will get through peer review the easiest, so you can eventually get tenure and do what you want to do. And then when you get to tenure and you do what you want to do, it involves making fun of people who are trying to do what you just did, basically, apparently.
Yeah, it's so fucking smug, man. It's so smug. And it's just so disheartening that these people got so much support on the internet from prominent people like Richard Dawkins and Michael Shermer, who have massive followings, all patting themselves on the back. What's the dude's name? The guy that was a neuroscientist that then became a new atheist, Sam Harris. Him, all of these these rationalists, these so-called rationalists that they just thought this was the most brilliant and hilarious thing, and I think it's tragic. I really think it's tragic.
Yeah, it really goes to show, we've talked about this a lot in the podcast, but a lot of the kind of right-wing atheist movement is starting to show its head in the past 10 years or so, and how radical a difference there is between that sort of movement and people on the political left. And it seems like the political scene at large is really kind of driving a wedge between those groups and showing the initial conditions and how different they are between them. Whereas, you'd probably think that if people were atheists or sort of, non-religious, they'd have a lot in common. But man, I can't imagine. I would much rather hang out with somebody who's like a left-wing and heavily religious, or at least even like a centrist, than these right-wing atheists who think that basically you can solve everything through science and quote-unquote reason. Right. And this ultimate kind of reductionism. Right. But that's like a whole other podcast episode, so...
It is. And not only that, but I will say I actually kind of I read the article, and it's not as nonsensical as they claim it is. It's kind of cool. It's kind of funny. Like, of course, is it taking a lot of the tropes that we have so often heard in gender studies or in feminist theory? Sure, there's nothing really novel about what they're saying. It's just ordered in a particular way that fits within a certain echo chamber, right? So there's nothing like groundbreaking about the research. But what they said, I'm kind of like, I actually think it's kind of a fun thought experiment. Because really to say the conceptual penis is no different than talking about just the idea of the phallus as a concept or the idea of masculinity. It's just, it uses the word penis, and to them that has some sort of absolute correspondent referent in male biology, and so they can't see it in a conceptual sense. And this is what it made me think, and I actually tweeted this out. I said, dude, with these motherfuckers that are so boring in their rationalism, can you imagine watching a movie with them? How fucking boring. Like, can you imagine like reading a book or like poetry or listening to music or sort of like experimenting with things? Like, do they have imaginations? Do they have the ability to create outside of the bounds of rationality, or does everything have to be falsifiable? I don't know, man. They just seem like boring, grumpy motherfuckers.
No, Austin, I don't think you realize that metaphor is automatically statements that have no correspondence to reality. And so you need to only use terms that have direct correspondence to sense impressions. Otherwise, you can't achieve any truth value whatsoever. So, wait. That was an idea. Those were ideas that were completely destroyed 100 years ago. But yet, all of a sudden, They're back. Logical positivism is back.
Oh, I hope it goes away.
Just like Nazism, please. Logical positivism is coming back at the exact same time. Who's our new Carnac?
Oh, interesting. Fuck, man. Everything is metaphor. Shitty minute, over.
All right, so for our main segment today, we're talking a little bit about utilitarianism.
Ooh.
Last week we talked about, the fuck did we talk about?
Empathy, compassion, rational compassion, that Paul Bloom book, Against Empathy, and whether or not we think that empathy is a good basis from which to build an ethic.
Yeah, and you often described a lot of kind of your understanding of empathy being a much broader category of feeling than just the way that, say, a psychologist would describe empathy. We talked a little about the foundations of empathetic feeling and how maybe you can go about structuring any notion of that so as to better support, an understanding of compassion and care for others that would actually be more effective than the way maybe it currently is. But that was all sort of a setup to get to this discussion of utilitarianism, which is ultimately the goal of a lot of these things, right? Bloom himself is, I believe, a utilitarian, and comes from this kind of Peter Singer style of utilitarianism, which has become very popular in the past, 30 or 40 years, and emphasizing that our kind of moral intuitions oftentimes need to be challenged for logical consistency. And that a lot of times our moral intuitions revolve around things that give us a sort of virtue signal or a prime that makes us feel good about ourselves, and not necessarily logically consistent with what we say we would believe is good. And so utilitarians try to challenge these intuitions and argue that we should be more logically consistent in our rational compassion, rather than just some general emotive sense of compassion or empathy for others that oftentimes ends up with us not really caring about the ultimate good, but about some sort of temporary or transitory good that doesn't actually fit what we say we believe about what is good. That's a little vague, but I think we can set it up with that way and talk a little bit about what this modern utilitarianism is, and what the good and bad things are about it, yeah?
Yeah, that sounds good to me. I mean, do you want to talk a little bit about the history, just very briefly, of utilitarianism and Bentham and Mill and the idea of the hedonic calculus and shit like that?
Yeah, so we can go back to, Bentham is really kind of considered the first utilitarian, right? Although John Stuart Mill is probably the one who kind of theorizes utilitarianism the best in his book, Utilitarianism. And the idea there is, Mill says in his greatest happiness principle that actions are right insofar as they tend to produce happiness, and wrong insofar as they tend to produce unhappiness. positing this notion that the effects or the consequences of our actions should determine for us rationally whether or not the actions themselves are good. And so things like motives and virtuous characteristics a person has, and religious fidelity and whatever else are only secondarily important. What matters most of all is the effect or the happiness produced by the action. And the word, kind of technical term used for that is utility, which is where this term utilitarianism comes from. And so, that's been around for 200 years, 200 plus years, that idea. Recently, in the last, 30 or 40 years, Peter Singer and others have kind of come up as a new wave of utilitarians in arguing that, especially at the level of like public policy and other areas, we don't do a very good job of actually maximizing the total happiness. We tend to, base policy a lot on what makes us individuals sort of feel good without necessarily maximizing total happiness, which in some ways might not actually make us feel so good. So like a good example would be giving to charity. Do we give to charity, or do we promote giving to charity in a way to make people be able to publicly show it and feel good about themselves and have sort of a social status based upon it? Or do we try to make it more efficient and actually get to the people who it would maximize the most happiness of? Singer himself had a kind of famous thought experiment called the drowning child thought experiment, where he kind of talked about this idea that if there was a child drowning and you were walking by some lake or something and the child's drowning, do you think you have a moral obligation, assuming there's not going to be any like intense danger to yourself, to save the child? And he usually asks his students this, and pretty much everyone's going to raise their hand, right? Of course I have a moral obligation to save the child, assuming I'm not going to, there's no sharks in the water or something. I'm obligated to save the child. Everyone agrees. And then Singer basically says, well, what if that child was 20,000 miles away? And you didn't have to jump in to save the child, but you could exert just as much effort, like maybe write a check, and it would also save the child's life. Do you have a moral obligation to do that? And obviously fewer people raise their hands. And so his argument is basically, why is it that we all agree we have a moral obligation to save a child when they're right next to us, but we don't have that moral obligation to save the child when they're not right next to us, even though maybe the same amount or less effort would have to be undertaken to do that? So, writing a check is even easier than jumping into a lake, right? Why do we not feel that moral obligation? And he says that's not rational. If you actually have a rational obligation to save a child next to you, you have just as much of a rational obligation to save a child not next to you, assuming you're not putting yourself in harm's way and whatnot. So that's kind of a good example, I think, of what these modern utilitarians are trying to do. They're trying to get us to think more logically about how we can maximize the good, regardless of how it makes us feel.
Right. Now, what do you think about the sort of Peter Singer? Because Bloom seems to be coming from the sort of more Singerian perspective than, the kind of the idea of like establishing an hedonic calculus in the Bentham or Mill sense, right? So what do you think about Singer? At face value, it seems like an interesting thought experiment, right? The drowning child experiment, and the idea of what he calls it the moral circle, and expanding that moral circle seems to be a useful way of thinking through how we could, or maybe how we ought to, engage ethically in a global world, especially a global world that's more ever connected. The idea of trying to claim ignorance about the atrocities that are taking place in Somalia or Yemen or Syria. Today, a bus exploded and 68 children were murdered by a suicide bomber, and it wasn't covered in the news at all. But of course, the Manchester attack, it just dominated the airwaves. So why is that the case? And does that have to do with this moral circle? And is there a way in which the sort of Singerian principle would help us? Would expand our circle of compassion? And is that a good thing, bad thing? What do you think about Singer?
That's a good question, I think, with the moral circle idea. I think we'd probably both agree that the idea of expanding the moral circle is a great thing. Of course we should do that. And I use Singer's drowning child thought experiment every year in my Philosophy 101 class to talk about some of these idea of challenging our moral intuitions and stuff. It's really a great idea, and I think we'd both agree with it. That's probably not the issue we would have with utilitarianism. certainly we would want to expand the moral circle, right? But do we? I mean, does appealing to an obligation to maximize happiness, does anybody actually feel like they have that obligation? What's the rational justification for it? Now, that doesn't mean that everyone feels like they need to have a rational obligation, or rational justification, of your moral obligations. 99.9% of people have no need to rationally justify their obligations, right? Only people like us who want to think about this stuff. But it does seem kind of telling to me that while I think utilitarianism has done a lot of good in promoting some of these ideas about being more efficient and how we're compassionate and focusing on maximizing happiness, especially for those who most are without it, and expanding the moral circle and all this stuff, is that ultimately actually going to do that? Because it seems to me anybody who doesn't want to do that, or who wants to shrink or retract the moral circle, can be very effective at doing it without appealing to reason whatsoever.
Yeah, and this is one of my issues maybe with Bloom's idea of rational compassion that we sort of hinted on last week when we were talking about the psychological experiment by, I just forgot the dude's name, in the 60s.
No, Stanley Milgram?
Yeah, Milgram's experiment. We were talking about, okay, so the idea of compassion or rational compassion sounds interesting just at face value, but what if the principle of utilitarianism, the principle that is supposed to produce the highest amount of utility, what if it is something that is controlled by a certain people group and their notion of utility actually benefits only a minority, or it only benefits the people in power, or it is distorted utility? It doesn't actually create the greatest good for the globe. So the question is then about power, right? It's how do we determine that rational basis? How do we develop the appropriate, or how do we attune ourselves appropriately so that we can rationally work through what would actually lead to the greatest amount of good? And what does it mean to create the greatest amount of good? Is it just stimulating pleasure? Is it stimulating happiness? What does that mean? Because according to Western capitalist democracy, the greatest good is to stimulate growth economically. That's the idea. That's what GDP becomes the benchmark of all economic factors. But growth doesn't necessarily equate to flourishing, or doesn't equate to equality, or doesn't equate to autonomy or freedom necessarily. So it's a much more complex system, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's no coincidence that John Stuart Mill himself didn't think any of his thoughts on liberty applied to Indians.
Right.
And so people in India were basically less than human. They're subject to the British Empire and didn't deserve to have the freedoms that British subjects had. And so similarly, would you regard their happiness as being of equal stature as those of the rational, upright British subjects? No, you're not going to consider that either. And so you all of a sudden retracted the moral circle in a way that, is pseudo-rational. And so it just seems like, I don't know that attempting to convince people to expand their moral circle in this rational way is actually, in this current rational way that utilitarianism does, is actually all that terribly effective unless they already have that intuition to do so. And so that really seems to be the crux of where this it's kind of not that utilitarianism necessarily is wrong, but that it's just very limited. Yeah, sure, happiness is important, and obviously I would say I would much rather if we focused on maximizing happiness than maximizing economic growth, given how unequal that can be. But
instead of GDP, they have GDH, right? GNH, gross national happiness, which is an economic factor, an economic benchmark that I think Amartya Sen and stuff like that have put forth.
Yeah, which is great because nations like Denmark always end up at the top of those things, and the Netherlands and Sweden and Northern European countries with strong welfare states, social democracies, they tend to end up with this much greater gross national happiness on average than, say, America, which has maybe the greatest sort of gross growth in total, right? But then doesn't sort of divide up the happiness equally. And a lot of the marginal happiness of those who already have the most, in terms of, say, access to property and access to using their rights and liberties, isn't very much. The marginal happiness is very little for each additional dollar, say, that they have. Whereas sort of the happiness at the lower margins, at those who have very little of it, is much greater per dollar, so to speak. We'd probably agree, and liberals tend to argue that this is how we should think about it: happiness over growth, right? But even that, in a philosophical sense, seems, while good, sort of limited.
Yeah, better, but not best.
Yeah, so like one of my favorite examples to talk about is Derek Parfit's The Repugnant Conclusion, or sometimes it's called the Mere Addition Paradox. You ever heard about that? We might have talked about it previously in the show. I don't remember.
Yeah, because he just passed away a couple of months ago.
Yeah,
and you talked about it then. But yeah, kind of expand on it a little bit more, because I'm not as familiar with Parfit as you are.
Yeah, so I mean, his actual version of it in Reasons and Persons is a little. It's a lot complicated. So I'll kind of do the truncated version that I talk about sometimes in class.
Yeah, didn't he write 2 books in his entire life?
And they're both 1,000 pages.
One is like, one's like 1,200. Yeah, exactly. He spent like 30 years writing the first one and 20 years writing the second one.
Yeah, talk about not giving a shit about about publishing. I'll just publish 2 fucking books and they'll be the size of 8 books.
Oh, Jesus. I love it.
So the Mere Addition Paradox, or the Repugnant Conclusion, depending on how you're couching it, a really truncated version of it might be: consider one society. We'll call it Society A. And this society has a lot of people, maybe we'll say billions and billions. And the average happiness of each person in the world is slightly above the point of despair. So life is worth living, but just kind of barely, not all that much on average. And there's lots of people on the different spectrums, right? Some people are really well off, some people are miserable, and some people are to the point of not wanting to live at all. But on average, since there's more people that are despairing than that are, incredibly wealthy, it's just a little bit above the point of despair. And compare that to, or contrast that to Society B, which has very few people, maybe we'll say a couple million, or World B, excuse me. And this world has several million people, but the average happiness is much greater than it is in the first world. And so you have not just non-despairing, but the average person has in the, like, say, 10th percentile of happiness compared to World A. Which of those worlds has the greatest total happiness? It would be World A.
Well, the World A, yeah. I mean, if you're doing a quantitative measure, sure.
Yeah. And so every additional person you add to that world is sort of contributing to the greatest total happiness, right? Even though their lives are not that great. And so in Parfit's version, he talks about, what if you add somebody who's, despairing to one world to the other, and so this kind of marginal addition, but that's not really all that necessary. Whereas World B, while the average happiness is much greater, the total happiness is much less. And so which world is basically better is the idea. And we have these kind of debates all the time, right? Where we're talking about, like, what if climate change causes an immense scarcity in resources? Would we be better off with a few million people in the world? Maybe it's like, 500 million people in the world as opposed to 7 billion. Could we divide up resources much, much better that way and provide for a greater average happiness for everybody? Did you ever watch that British show Utopia that was on a couple years ago?
You know what? I only saw a couple episodes, and I'm glad you actually put that into the forefront of my mind, because it was amazing. The opening credits are one of the most beautiful opening credits sequences I've ever seen.
Yeah, where's Jessica Hyde? Oh my God! But this show's kind of.
I only saw a couple episodes.
You got to go back and watch it, man. It's so great.
And it's only 3 seasons, right?
I think just 2, maybe 3. I don't remember exactly.
2 seasons. Okay, yeah.
But the show is kind of built around this idea of, we're basically gonna have a funneling of human lives. Rather than having everybody die in such horrible, atrocious ways, let's just actually kind of make it so that sterilize a large amount of the population and get down to that 500 million or so mark over the next couple generations. So that, people won't have kids, but they won't necessarily have kids that will then die of starvation and famine and natural disasters and whatnot. And so you can see why these people had a rational justification. They weren't genocidal maniacs. They thought they were doing what was right in the end. Now, utilitarians get around a lot of this stuff by asking, or like sort of rejecting total happiness and talking more about average happiness. And you have like rule utilitarians versus act utilitarians and all that. But really, I don't know. I kind of feel like it all boils down to the basic idea of whether or not happiness is the only thing that matters, is the only actually valuable good. And if it is, it just seems to me like, world A is better. But that goes against our intuition.
Right. I mean, I guess I would have a problem with that just because I'm not interested in quantitative analyses of happiness. I don't think happiness is something you can quantitatively measure in that way. So to me, I actually think that world B is better because even though they don't have a greater total amount of happiness, I'm not sure that the metric for measuring total happiness is accurate with regards to understanding what happiness is. Because I don't think happiness is necessarily quantifiable. So yeah, if you want to break it down into, on a scale of 1 to 10, you've got 1 billion 2s versus 1 million 6s. Which is better? Well, 1 billion 2s is more than 1 million 6s. But I'm not sure that it's in itself works for me. I think it frames the question in the wrong way. But that's just because I have a problem with quantitative analysis in that sense. But with that said, I think my biggest problem with utilitarianism is that it treats people purely within a consequentialist narrative. And I'm okay with consequentialism like in the Epicurean sense, I'm okay with the idea of seeking pleasure as an end. I don't know if it's like an absolute end or the only way to measure things, but I'm okay with the idea of seeking pleasure and trying to maximize the greatest amount of pleasure. I think that's great. But at the same time, I'm not sure that is the lone calculus that ought to determine factors. And if 51%, like if it's just 51% utility versus 49%, well then fuck the other 49%. They can suffer because 51% of the people are going to be happy, which is the type of thing you run into within a pure utilitarian logic. For me, I think you have to kind of have a both and. You want to seek utility or human flourishing in a global sense, but also you have to also seek to stimulate flourishing at the individual and particular level. So we have to think both in macro and micro terms, and I think utilitarianism only thinks within the macro, and so then people become bits within a system to serve the greater goal of whatever runs the rational calculus. And that's a problem for me, because then individuals are just means end. And that's why it fits so well within capitalism, right? Because people are just commodities. And as long as the system expands, that is, as long as GDP grows, then that's fine. Who cares about the expansion of inequality? Because it's growth, it's growth, it's growth. And then they teach that, or they spread that bullshit about trickle down. No, but no, it'll trickle down and jobs will be created. And, a rising tide raises all boats. All of that kind of fits within this logic that I think is ultimately damaging for genuine global flourishing. And there has to be both. You can't separate the particular from the universal in this instance.
What do you think flourishing would be if not happiness?
Well, I guess it depends on what you mean by happiness. I think for me, I think of vitality. So because the word eudaimonia, how it's translated happiness, sometimes people say it's better translated as flourishing. I don't know. For some reason, my mind, I picture like a field of flowers that are like alive, that things are living in the Spinozist sense, that they are maximizing their potency. I think that's what flourishing would be. And I think it will differ for persons. I think it will differ from community to community, from subculture to subculture, from state to state, country to country, and then that there would be complexities even within that. So for me, flourishing would have something to do with this idea of vitality, and I want to be careful with this term, because even this term can fit within a sort of efficiency matrix that would fit within a sort of capitalist paradigm. But I like the idea of optimization. So like human optimization would be figuring out what your body is capable of. And I agree with Spinoza that we're not even aware of what the body is capable. But figuring out maybe what the body can do, or what the mind can do, or what communities can do, and what art can do, and what cultures can do, and what religions could be, and what the local community center can offer, and figuring those things out and maximizing them to as great a degree within their potency to, one, bring pleasure to people, but two, I'm not sure it's just simply about pleasure, because sometimes things are not immediately understood as pleasurable, but then ultimately end up being pleasurable, but they still maximize potency. So there has to be an element of rationality and reflection that comes along with it. And so there's this dialectical struggle or agonism between rationally thinking through what could produce long-term vitality and feeling instantaneous pleasure and having an element of hedonism, but also an element of rationalism, and they all kind of join together in this perpetual struggle.
Okay, let me ask a question, because one of the issues I have with utilitarianism also is, I mean, I really like going back to G.E. Moore's naturalistic fallacy, and the idea that, he mentions that the phrase happiness is good is a synthetic proposition, right? It's not analytic. It's you're adding something to the subject in the predicate. So happiness is good is not the same thing as saying 2 + 2 = 4 or A is A, or bachelors are unmarried or whatever. You're actually adding something in the predicate to what happiness is. It is good, which means for me that's a kind of a major problem with utilitarianism, is it assumes happiness literally means the same thing as good, right? It's just what good is, which makes it an analytic statement. I think even just intuitively, we don't think that's true. And so I kind of would cite that idea as part of our intuitive response against utilitarianism. But could the same thing be applied to this idea of flourishing? Like, if flourishing is a natural, it's at least based in something natural, right? Whatever is optimization is based on what your preconditions are. And I know, like, in Deleuze and Spinoza stuff, you have like the virtual, and so it's not really natural and all that stuff. Okay, fine. But doesn't that still, to say that is good, to say flourishing is good or potency is good, doesn't that in some sense, isn't that a synthetic statement? And if so, what are the reasons for that?
Yeah, I kind of think, I don't know if I've actually been thinking about this. I don't know if I think that any statements are analytic. And this is something that Deleuze starts with.
Yeah, I mean,
he starts
okay, I
with
see
the
that.
Principle. Okay,
I see where you're going.
So, yeah, I don't know if I believe in the principle of identity or the principle of identity whatsoever. So
this podcast
I'd
is
wanna
just a
start
series
from
of you
difference.
denying basic philosophical axioms from all of history.
Yeah, so
I don't think I believe
with,
A equals A. I think I believe in the excluded middle.
I mean, so I'm okay with saying that it's a synthetic statement to say that flourishing is good, because I'm also okay with recognizing that flourishing isn't an absolute quote unquote good, but that I think that for some reason it's a metaphor, it's an image, it's a hyperstitional image, which is a word that sometimes gets bandied about under certain circles, like the Nick Land circles that don't have the best reputations. But the idea of hyperstition, I think, is a useful term, because it's basically an imaginative concept that you project that comes into actualization through its projection, right? And so for me, it fits with this idea of the future image in Sartre, where he says sometimes we just posit future images to stimulate the affects in the present to realize those images. And so for me, the idea of flourishing is a sense. It's not an absolute fixed state of being that must be, but rather I think it's just a pragmatic placeholder that has efficacy insofar as it seems to give me a sense that helps me think and feel and act in a particular way. And I'm totally okay with saying that maybe flourishing isn't a great idea because it has too much baggage in the Aristotelian tradition or something along those lines. And that's fine with me. Maybe there's a better term or a better metaphor that I'll come up with in the future. But right now, for some reason, it just seems to have a certain sense to me that impels me forward in my thinking that I find useful.
Okay, so it's like the hyperstitional thinking stuff you're talking about. It's a pragmatic means to think in this ethical sense. Is that what you're kind of saying? Like, it's the most helpful way to think ethically?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't know if it's the most helpful way, of course, but I think for me right now in my thinking, it is the most helpful way for me. But this is why I love being able to discuss with other people, because they can introduce nuances and introduce problems. They can problematize the idea. Deleuzians love to talk about problematizing. My old PhD supervisor, James Williams, loved to talk about problematizing. And some people are like, if you talk about problematizing, I'm going to fucking vomit. But because it's like, oh, but that wonderfully problematizes things. But it does. It problematizes. It's that idea of the foundation of philosophy, is that philosophy begins with wonder. Philosophy begins with puzzlement. And I want to perpetually be in that state of puzzlement because of problematization, because of wonder when I look at the chaos of the world. And to me, I'm okay with holding flourishing as just a pragmatic concept at the moment.
So philosophy begins in wonder, but it does not begin in axiomatic analytic truths.
Unless that is an axiomatic truth that philosophy begins in wonder.
I think it's synthetic for sure.
It is definitely synthetic. Yeah.
So I guess the reason I asked the question of is it a means, is then that gets me thinking. Well, yeah. I totally am sympathetic and think that there's a lot to mine from the idea of this hyperstitional thinking, all this creative thinking that the Deleuzians do on sort of moral philosophy, to think about creative ways to. I'm kind of repeating myself, but the creative ways to think ethically, basically. But if that's the means, right, the method, a more helpful way is to think this way than it is to do a utilitarian calculus, which is a different means. I still feel like both of those are means. And neither of those gets necessarily to the end of those means. Meaning, if happiness is good as a synthetic statement and flourishing is good as a synthetic statement, where are we getting these statements from? Like, why are we determining these are the things that's good? Is there a way to reason to those synthetic statements and provide sort of justification for those predicates as being good? What do we mean by good, essentially, when we say happiness is good and flourishing is good? Well, what's good about them? What makes them good? I mean, I'm not saying I have an answer to that.
Yeah.
I tend to think that something synthetic a priori, like in the Kantian sense, appeals to me more on that.
Explain what that means, because this is a kind of difficult concept, but it's foundational for the history of Western philosophy. This idea of the difference between an analytic a priori and a synthetic a posteriori, and then a synthetic a priori. So, just real quick, what is a synthetic a priori, and what is all
Do we really want to do that right now?
just super quickly, because when you say synthetic a priori, like, what does that even mean?
Yeah, so I guess really briefly, like an analytic statement is any statement that's true just by the nature of the definitions of the terms. So if I say bachelors were unmarried, that's an analytic statement. It's true because the definition of bachelors is to be unmarried. A synthetic statement would just be any statement that the predicate adds to the subject. So if I say Austin is a jerk, it's a false synthetic statement, first of all.
Could you imagine?
It's not contained within Austenness.
Could you imagine if you were like, that'd be like such a dig, man, if you were like, this is an analytic statement, Austin is a jerk. I'd be like,
no, it's contained in Austenness to be a jerk.
Yeah.
Whereas Troy would be Austin in basketball is an analytic statement, by the way.
Whoa. Moving on.
So yeah, synthetic statements, analytic statements, that's the difference. Is the predicate adding anything to the subject you didn't already know? A priori and a posteriori just mean, do you know a thing before you have experience or after experience? So an a priori statement would be something you know without needing any experience to rely upon to know it. A posteriori statements would be something like, the sun's going to rise tomorrow. The sun did rise today. I only know that because I experienced it and saw it, right? I couldn't have necessarily proven that was going to be the case without a shadow of a doubt until I had experience. Now, the question of whether or not there are a priori, is a priori knowledge at all, is a controversial subject. I mean, like, Hume states that there is no a priori knowledge other than basically tautologies, like 2 and 2 equals 4 and stuff like that. Kant kind of famously thought that there were some a priori statements that you could actually synthesize to, right? So statements that you can actually know that aren't tautologies, that are also known by reason and not by experience. He just limited those to a lot fewer things than like the early rationalists wanted to. Like Descartes, who thinks you can know a whole shitload of things a priori, like God's existence and everything else.
Well, and if he believed that you could have absolute knowledge about everything if you just reasoned appropriately.
Yeah, there's clear and distinct ideas you can get.
Yeah, exactly. That it would be possible to go through your life without ever making a mistake.
Yeah, now that's all, it's a lot. But basically the idea was, can we think about morality without experience? So not relying upon experience, because then we're getting into a realm of, not having certitude. But also is synthetic, meaning we understand what we're talking about as being good is knowledge. It's not just a tautology. Not just like a bland axiomatic statement. Now, the reason why I think I want that to be the goal is that seems like if you're going to talk about the end goal of what's good, that's the kind of thing you're going to be talking about, a synthetic a priori. Whereas these other synthetic statements, flourishing is good, happiness is good, especially utilitarianism, focuses very much on the a posteriori, and that it's basically saying throughout experience we can see people like happiness. It is good. But that does seem to me to kind of beg the question of, well, isn't that assuming that it's good in the first place? I don't know it's providing any justification for that.
Right.
And again,
now
most people don't require that, but we're philosophers, so we do.
Yeah, exactly. So you said last week, be prepared next week for you were going to Kant all over my ass. So
that was an unfortunate use of terminology in retrospect.
Yeah, which, as a friend pointed out after our discussion about your student in class that called him Immanuel Kant, and then we laughed about, that's not right. A friend actually sent me a YouTube video that I sent to Troy this week that said, this is actually how you pronounce it in German. And I remember that this friend of mine, Scott, what up, Scott, if you're listening, that Scott had mentioned this to me in years past or in months past, that actually the appropriate way of saying the name Immanuel Kant is Immanuel Kant in German. So
it's not quite Kant. It's like Immanuel Kant.
Yeah, Kant.
It doesn't have the long
It's like if a New Zealander was saying cunt rather than American. Kunt. Okay, so let's cunt all over my ass, Troy.
I mean, that basically was it, right? Kant wants to do a synthetic a priori about the moral law. And I'm certainly not Kantian in that sense. But I do think that if we're going to talk about what's ultimately good and get to the foundations of that, then it's going to be this sort of synthetic a priori. I don't agree with Kant that that's this sense of a moral law, which we which we experience in the various forms of like our feelings of conscience and stuff, and you can do a transcendental deduction to talk about the moral law and all that stuff. I'm not down with that necessarily, but just the general foundational project of some sort of a synthetic a priori just seems to me to get at the heart of the issue of philosophical ethics, moral philosophy, in a way that I feel like utilitarianism kind of skirts and just assumes we're not going to be able to do that, and it's kind of a project that's doomed. So we might as well just figure out how to maximize efficiency with whatever we have now.
Interesting. So how do we tie all of this together? Empathy, compassion, rational compassion, utilitarianism, the sort of idea of synthetic a priori. If you could draw a through line to the ethic that we have sort of been exploring, how do you think we ought to think through ethics, considering empathy, compassion, rationality, synthetic a priori, in contradistinction to utilitarianism? How do we begin this project?
Yeah, let me tell you what my kind of spiel is that I usually give to students when we're discussing ethics, and see if you see that through line the same way I do.
Okay.
I think that utilitarianism does a really great job of challenging us to think critically about our moral intuitions, which I absolutely agree we need to do, because our moral intuitions are usually based upon evolutionary adaptive beliefs and restricting our moral circle to our tribal identity and finding ways to basically prime dopamine release in our brain when other people see us do good things, or we see us do good things, and things that ultimately are not good. And so, well, not necessarily evil, they're certainly not the best. And so I absolutely think that any challenge like that comes from the utilitarian side, I'm going to agree with. I'm going to promote and come alongside of, and want to help those arguments prosper. And certainly, being more efficient in giving to charity and caring about drowning children in Africa as much as drowning children in America is absolutely important, right? I think anybody who wants to think ethically is going to agree with that. I don't see, in the practical level, any real need to create dissension or disagreement on those issues with utilitarians. But on the longer term project about thinking about what's good, and what I challenge students to do is, if you really want to challenge your intuitions, don't just challenge only your intuitions about practically what's good. Challenge your intuitions about theoretically what's good too. Is happiness really the ultimate goal of life? And that maximizing it for others is a worthwhile ethical thing to do. Of course it is. But is that the only thing that matters? Or does happiness matter because something else matters? Other things like maybe liberty and freedom and equality and maybe even a sense of flourishing and things like that, right? Maybe more foundational notions. And then even, why are those things good in the first place? And kind of think critically about tracing these things back to a foundation. It seems kind of like navel-gazing to a lot of people, I think, this idea. And why don't we just focus on maximizing happiness and everyone else can choose for themselves what they do? But even that itself is celebrating liberty, right? The ability to choose for yourself. Why is that good? Right? So I think these questions are just always there, whether you like it or not. And we tend to just ignore them because they make our heads ache. And I like headaches. No, I don't like headaches. I hate headaches. But I like conceptual headaches.
Yeah, same.
And I think if we want to engage in the project of creating a better world, we need to think very critically about what that word better means. And not just stop at sort of the surface level of, well, everyone's happy. I'm down with that, but that's not the end goal.
Yeah.
What do you think?
I like that. Yeah, I like that. I think it's really interesting. You said we should even challenge the idea, these concepts of liberty and freedom and justice. I've been thinking a lot over the past year, 6 months to a year, about those foundational ideas themselves upon which the democracies of the West, the capitalist democracies of the West, have been built. That even they actually, to me, seem rather minimalist. They seem rather underdeveloped for what we could actually think about. And that I think we can actually think through bigger concepts. What are those concepts? I don't know, but this is where, like, the idea of flourishing to me for some reason feels like a bigger concept. And it might just be because of the sort of particularity that I feel when I say it, when I wield that term, that's hard for me to communicate. But I feel like that term, if the sort of foundation of democracy is the pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, what if it's life and flourishing? Because I like life in the Deleuzian sense, the capital L, this idea of potency and maximization of potency, or the Spinozist idea of conatus, that things are always going to seek to maximize their own vitality or strength or capacity. And those things seem to me to be more interesting than liberty and freedom and justice. And so I've been thinking through that, and I don't know, I think it's really useful. It's an interesting experiment, because I think we just kind of accept what we've been raised to believe are the greatest goods, the summum bonum, right? And I'm not sure what the fucking greatest good is. I don't even think that we know what the greatest good is, because I think things will potentially be better than the greatest good, So I believe in this idea of process, that the idea of the greatest goods of yesteryear are just average ideas today, and that the greatest goods of tomorrow will be average the day after tomorrow, and that it's this perpetual idea of always seeking better. So yeah, I'm kind of okay with that, and I find that process of discomfort, conceptual discomfort, or epistemological discomfort, I find that actually rather comforting. I kind of enjoy that space. I find it to be very productive just in my own life, and even in my relationships and my friendships and in my work and the way that I engage politically with things. I kind of enjoy that space. So yeah, I'm all for that.
Yeah, so if we're giving you a headache right now, we've done a good job, actually. It's not because we suck at podcasting.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so sick. Let's transition now to our Sticky Leaves segment. This is a segment of our podcast where one of us tells us what it is that's giving us meaning in a world that is often devoid of meaning. Troy, what's your Sticky Leaves for this week, brother?
My Sticky Leaves is a book that I recently read, a really short book, called Ways of Seeing by John Berger, or Berger, I'm not sure how you pronounce it. You ever heard of this?
English art critic guy. He did, he's great. He's great. Yeah, he has a wonderful series on BBC that you can watch on YouTube for free. It's great. Go check it out.
Yeah, I think they did the BBC series and then compiled the book together as a sort of somewhat extended version of the series. I haven't watched the TV series yet. I downloaded it though. I'm going to watch it at some point. But it's a real short book. It's just like, 4 or 5 chapters. A couple of the chapters are only pictures. Like there's not even a written argument. I'm not sure I actually fully grasped those. But the actual written argument, I think it was a lot of ideas, obviously heard before, but haven't done a lot of work in like art criticism or aesthetic theory or any of that. That's definitely an area that I'm very much a novice. And so there's a lot of talk about sort of a class conflict interpretation of art, like referencing Walter Benjamin's The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. And there's an entire chapter in the book about portraiture in like, sort of Renaissance, post-Renaissance art in Europe, and how sort of interpreting portraiture in a way to talk about sort of class consciousness and class distinctions in society at the time, and that portraiture was used in a way to sort of reify that. There's an entire chapter about sort of analyzing classical nudes, and that was actually my favorite chapter of the whole book, because he talks a lot about how when you look at nudist paintings, the female is always being looked at by men, but is never actually looking back at them. I thought I'd never noticed that, like, the female is always being gazed at, but never actually gazing at anybody, which is really interesting. And, sort of unprompted, for Mother's Day a couple weeks ago, took my mom to the Getty Center.
Oh, I fucking love the Getty.
Yeah, I've been to many times, and there was a new exhibit there on, I think it was 18th century Italian art, and it was all art that was depicting cultural events. So it was like processions and, natural disasters and princes' birthdays and stuff like that. And I was able to kind of look at a lot of these paintings from this sort of analysis that I had, somewhat, superficially sort of engaged in through thinking about it with reading this book lately. And it was really interesting. Like, it really gave me a new way of seeing, as the title suggests, art. And that's not to say that, the actual sort of artistic process and all the art theory that is involved in the more technical aspects of art is unnecessary. Obviously, that stuff is very important. And although I don't know much about it, it's all very intriguing. But this is an interesting, just different way of seeing. It's just an additional way of looking at art through this prism that we're so trained through youth to view art just as sort of one cultural epoch begets another. Classical art begets, or Baroque begets classical, begets Romanticism, begets modern, and so on and so forth. As like it's like this linear progression that has to have always, it could only have gone one way. And this adds a new element to looking at the historicity of it that makes it much more of, like a dramatic. It's like a narrative. There's something going on here. You really understand why the people would have wanted this piece of art, why they would have appreciated it, why it might have shocked them. And one of my favorite things about the book was the theme that the great artists, the masterpieces, are the ones that challenge the normal pieces of art. So when a portrait depicts all the property that somebody owns, and that's why they always have, surrounded by all their goods to show, look at how much stuff I own, right? I'm powerful, I'm wealthy. And it's always the man's always standing straight up and looking directly at the sort of, onlooker's viewpoint. And then you have a piece like, I don't remember the guy's name, but it was some some portrait of a guy, and it's just called Yawning. It's a famous picture, a famous painting at the Getty. It's a dude just with his arms outstretched and yawning in the most obnoxious way possible. Like, you can see it, but the listener can't. And it's just this amazing, ridiculous painting. And I was just like, dude, that is so great because it challenges the sort of stoic, property-owning, powerful portrait, which is the normal sort of reason why you'd pay someone to make a portrait of yourself, right?
Right.
And that was just great. It was a super fun way to look at that painting and why it was so shocking and awesome. And then same with, like Van Gogh's irises is at the Getty.
Mm-hmm.
And Monet's haystacks or wheat stacks is at the Getty. And those are two really kind of shocking, different kind of paintings given their context, like Impressionism from Monet. And to see it in that context of challenging some status quo of what a painting had to be, oil painting had to be. That's just, we think about art that way now because we're in the context and we're immersed in it. But to think about historical art that way is just, I don't know. I know it's just normal for most people that are kind of in the art world, but that was a really fun thing for me to kind of dive into a little bit lately.
Yeah, that's great. I have only seen the first episode on YouTube. And the reason that I watched is because he just recently passed away. I think within the last 6 months or something like that, right?
Yeah, January, I think.
Yeah, and so I was not familiar with his series prior to that. And when he passed, my buddy Scott, again, shout out again to Scott, was like, dude, you don't know who John Berger is? I was like, no. He's like, bro, you got to check him out. And so I watched the first episode and I was like, oh, this series is really cool because it's kind of psychedelic at the same time. It's almost like an instance of the very ideas that he's talking about. He's got these really intense, piercing eyes, very hypnotic, and I don't know. He kind of has a weird, he's almost like shamanistic in his cadence, in the way that he talks. And it was really enjoyable. The first episode was. So I'll have to check out the rest of the series and the book, man. That's cool. It was really cool.
Yeah, definitely find that book. I got it for a couple dollars online used. It's super small. You can probably read it in a couple sittings. No problem.
Did you get it from Verso?
No, I bought it used.
Because I believe that Verso has a very cheap paperback or ebook, maybe a Kindle version. I'm not 100% sure that you can get, but Verso books, they definitely have some of Berger's writings, and I'm pretty sure Ways of Seeing is one of the writings they have.
Yeah, so check that out. It's well worth your while.
Sick, man. So it's interesting though to think about that, the idea that the greats are the paintings or whatever. I mean, even in film, the films or the photographs that challenged the status quo.
I would say in a genre, yeah.
In a genre.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Because I think a lot of times when we think of Michelangelo, we think of him as like a great technician, right? That he was this amazing sculptor. His technique, his prowess, his technical prowess was second to none. But maybe there is something more subversive about what he was doing with the Statue of David. Maybe there was something more subversive about the Sistine Chapel, which clearly there's some very interesting imagery, and it is a masterpiece, but it isn't just another mural on a church ceiling, is it? There's something unique and specific about it, and it has stood the test of time. And maybe there is something unique about Mona Lisa and some of other Da Vinci's work, and things that we don't. Obviously, Picasso. There are things that do challenge, and Dali and Magritte. Of course, then we're getting to the 20th century, so I mean, it seems more that it was intentional to be avant-garde and to kind of challenge the status quo. So I'm not sure that that's the same thing, but it is interesting to also go back to the Renaissance and Baroque periods and say, okay, so why is Caravaggio? Why are his paintings interesting? And why is Rembrandt interesting? That's kind of cool, man. It kind of makes me want to go back and look at it now again.
Yeah, I'm thinking about it as an analogy with science, and that, obviously technique is part of it, and so in science, like pure intelligence is part of it. But lots of people are purely intelligent, have a high IQ, right?
Right.
But only a few people can combine a high IQ and that technical ability with the sort of creative capacity to challenge what is considered to be obvious and accepted as normal and true. And so, like Einstein, what's the famous idea that Einstein couldn't do a lot of the math in his equations for general relativity? He had to call in Gödel to do some of that stuff. But his real genius wasn't in just the technical ability. It was more in the ability to think imaginatively about things like gravity, which we just kind of accept as being exactly as Newton thought that they were, right?
He even says as much. He actually says that about himself, that it was about his ability to kind of imagine and transform and think beyond things, that was really what was the thing that allowed him to theorize general relativity. Yeah,
and so in art, it'd be the same way, right? I mean, the greatest artists aren't just the ones who have the best technique. I mean, if that was the case, Dream Theater would be the greatest rock band of all time. It's like they have some of the greatest technicians, but they fucking suck and are terrible.
Hey man, John Petrucci is the man. He's the man.
Yeah, they're technically great, but they have like zero imagination whatsoever.
Yeah.
So I'm being hyperbolic, but yeah, there's the idea is the true genius and masterpiece is the one produced by both great technicality and a sort of creative vision that's unique and original and sets its own standard away from that that's already produced or been produced by the culture.
See, I really love that. I mean, I guess I kind of already am drawn to that type of thinking anyway, especially within the medium of film. I do the film podcast, and one of the areas of contention that my co-host Keir and I often butt heads over is with regards to the relation of avant-garde experimental films that are more conceptually driven versus films that, kind of stick to the more narratival elements of drama that we've come to understand from classic Hollywood schemas. That there's a protagonist, and the protagonist, begins in a state of relative comfort and then is dealt with some sort of obstacle that they have to overcome, and then they go through the obstacle and they go through all these challenges, and then there's like a battle with some sort of opponent and the typical protagonist antagonist struggle, man versus man, man versus nature, man versus self. And then they come through it and they've learned something at the outset and they go back into the world, but the world has changed because they've changed or whatever. Whatever the typical beats are, there's some sort of typical linear trajectory. And I'm not saying that that's bad. I'm not saying that they can't be amazing and inventive, but the films that I tend to find that are more exciting to me are, films that kind of even break the form of cinema. And it can just be like the film that we talked about this last week by Chantal Akerman, the Jean Dillman, which is basically a 3-hour slow cinema biographical monitoring of a housewife, not even a housewife because she's not married, but a single mother who peels potatoes and washes dishes and also happens to be a prostitute in France in the mid-1970s. To me, it's so profound in the ways that it transformed or challenged the forms of cinema and narratives of cinema and the way that women were depicted in cinema at that time. And I am really drawn to that. I love that sort of thing so much. So I kind of already dig that paradigm of thinking that you're talking about.
Yeah, and it's not even just that. I mean, you can have the radically experimental films that challenge the very notion of narrative and story. You can also have, smaller scale experiments where you have the same sort of linear narratives, but then you just challenge one part of it. Exactly. So like one of my favorite films and one of yours the past couple of years is like Mad Max Fury Road, right?
Yeah.
Which takes a very standard action movie formula and then just says, well, what if it was about women instead? And the men are the ones in the background who aren't really internalized all that much. And that's just, doesn't mean every movie has to be like that from now on, but that's just a challenging way to do an action film. And that's parts, not entirely. Also the technicality part of it's important as well. That's part of why it was so great.
Yeah. Yeah, like if you were to say that, abstractly, because I'm not even sure that this exists in reality, but say abstractly there is a serial type of art, the art that just checks all the boxes, that's just perfectly bland. Like take the most saccharine film you can think of, Serendipity with John Cusack and Kate Beckinsale, the romantic comedy, right? I would argue that even in a film like that, even in a film that is pure, what's the word I'm looking for, that just kind of checks all the boxes of how to make a film and how to write a script, and it's got all the cheesy elements, it's got the hot girl and the quirky guy, and it's got the ideas of fate and romance and love, and are they going to find each other, will they, won't they, it's got all those kind of typical elements. At the same time, even in a film like that, I think that there can be those subversive elements. They might be They might be buried, they might be hidden, but I think they're still there, at least in latent form. And so I think that even in every piece of art, that there is still something transformative and subversive and genre bending within them. It's just that they're buried under things. So the really creative artists are the ones that are able to either completely do something radical and avant-garde and totally change the form and just kind of throw it in your face, Piss Christ, or like Duchamp's The Fountain, something like that. Or, like you said, something where it's a typical narrative film, but there's just one thing that shines through, that challenges you, but it does it in a way that isn't so off-putting or too highbrow or too self-aggrandizing or something like that.
Yeah, it's like Andre Gorza's non-reformist reforms, but in art.
Yeah, exactly. Huh. Cool. Well, yeah, now I kind of want to go and I'm probably not going to sleep tonight, goddammit, because I'm going to go watch some John Berger.
All right, so I got a question for you, Austin.
Okay.
For our bullshitting segment.
Yeah.
I want to know what you think the orb is.
The orb, huh? Do you want to tell people what the orb even is?
Do people need to know what the orb is? If they don't, how are they ever going to know?
If you don't know the orb, good point. So, well, first of all, it's weird because you've got these foreign leaders who are standing in a semicircle around a glowing ball that has like the cutout of continents on it. Doesn't it look like it's got like a little cutout of continents on it?
Yeah, it's a globe.
Oh, it is a globe. Okay.
So they say.
So they say. I mean, dude, this is the Illuminati. This is it, brother. This is the Illuminati. No longer are they hiding anymore. They don't need to hide. They're just coming out straight and they're saying, yeah, the Illuminati, we run shit in this world and we illuminate our globes. That's the subtle hint that they were going after. See, we're illuminating our globe. We don't use a sort of opaque globe. We have a glow-in-the-dark one with a light inside, because we're the Illuminati. And
dude, if there was an Illuminati, we would know, because there's no way Trump wouldn't be talking about it.
He would have shared that secret already with the Russians.
Oh yeah, aliens, Bigfoot, Illuminati, none of it's real. We have our definitive proof because Trump has not spilled the beans on these things.
That is so true.
I think my favorite meme with the orb, I mean, first of all, having the Saudis and the Trumps in the same room together is like, has ever been a more quantitative mass of unearned ego in one room?
Yeah, unearned ego. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, I don't think there ever has been. But my favorite meme with the orb is the Lord of the Rings meme.
Oh, dude, when they put Saruman
remember
in?
the scene in Two Towers when Saruman uses the orb to, was he contacting Sauron? I don't remember how it works. And Gandalf has to cover it because who knows who could be watching. There's a great meme of, instead of the scene cutting to Sauron and the eye of Sauron and the whole thing, it cuts to the picture of the Saudis and Trump, and it's kind of amazing. It's the best.
I saw 2 Lord of the Rings memes that were instead of their hand being placed over a globe, it was placed over the eye of Sauron, which was kind of awesome. And then I saw another one where they photoshopped the dude on the left, who I don't even know who it was. So you got like the Saudi king in the middle, you got Trump on the right, and the dude on the left, they photoshopped Saruman in there, and it's like perfect. It is perfect, and he's just like staring into the camera lens. It's awesome.
Yeah, I'm glad that I think Trump should go on international visits more often, because a lot less gets done here, and it's all just kind of celebratory, gimmicky bullshit. Right. And it's kind of fun. Like, I almost enjoy him being president when he's just going to other countries, doing basically nothing, and we get lots of funny photos. Like, that's what the president should be. A celebratory position that has no power whatsoever.
That's true. Kind of like the Queen in Great Britain.
Exactly. We should just elect a king and queen every 4 years, and then fuck everything else.
In Ireland, they kind of do. The president of Ireland is actually the one who doesn't have power. So he's elected, but he doesn't really have the pinnacle of decision-making power. That's the prime minister, who was just Enda Kenny, but who recently stepped down or was replaced or whatever it was here in Ireland. But yeah, so the president is kind of like this old leprechaun-looking dude right now. I can't even remember his name right now. But anyway, he's basically just a figurehead, It's kind of just a novelty to have.
That's the way it should be, man. Because we obviously, obviously the president doesn't actually do anything. Because look who's president. I mean, if this guy can be president, then literally anybody can be president. And that means the job is stupid.
Well, The Rock is going to be president
he's also
next.
commander-in-chief. And that, so just full-on shoot, ineffective presidency. Let's just change the laws and make it basically like a monarchy. Constitutional monarchy, but we elect the monarchs instead of by divine right.
Yeah, but the cool thing would be is the one thing that the president in Ireland does have some powers. He's able to veto certain things or some shit like that. I can't remember. But one of the things is that he and his wife are big fans of philosophy, and so they have started doing a lot of work in education to introduce philosophy into secondary school. So yes, it's a figurehead that doesn't really do anything except for maybe do some cool experimental educational and theater and arts programs. That would be cool. I'll be president.
Yeah, so the vice president and the first lady.
Yeah, exactly.
Just no president.
Exactly. I love it. That's a great idea. All right. We need a new constitution.
Yeah, we elect the vice president and the first lady, and that's it. And they have to get married. Wait, so it's like The Bachelor. Like a Bachelor too. All combined into one.
I love it. I absolutely love it. That's a great idea.
And the woman can be president, and can be vice president, and the guy can be first husband. It's all for grabs. Bachelor, bachelorette switches off.
This is so perfect. I love it. All right. Well, we'll bring this up at the next local chapter meeting of Democratic Socialists of America.
The Owls at Dawn parliamentary system.
That's
no
right.
pun intended.
Well done. All right, sweet. Well, let's see what is going on this week in hip-hop, shall we?
Yep. What's up, Mike?
With first-class legroom, big cocktails for everyone, and a schedule you can depend on.
Hello, Owls at Dawn listeners, fans, and friends. This is Michael Burns with This Week in Hip-Hop. Gotta confess something first of all. I know I fucked up and delayed the podcast because I've been slow on some stuff. But it's because I have things going on in my life. I'm trying to move back to America so I can be more, in touch with the music for you all. But whatever, let's get to it. Some things have come out recently that I'm excited about. One thing literally came out today. I'm recording this on June 1st that I'm excited about. So we'll talk about that, a single and a forthcoming album. We'll talk about a New York Times article. Damn, scholarship. So the first thing and the main thing I want to talk about is a new album, but it's free. You can listen to it on SoundCloud, download it online, by Big Huss and Big Ghost. Big Ghost, someone we talk about on here because we like him and we like his beats. But it's a project called Cocaine Beach. 11 tracks, insanely strong. Big Huss is someone you might have listened to, you might not have. He's a Long Island-based dude from Hempstead. And if you don't think there's good rap music from Long Island, then you can, shut the fuck up, because names like Rock Marciano, De La Soul, and a bunch of others come to mind. And he's previously worked with Rock Marciano. You can hear, a similar world and aesthetic between Big Huss and Rock, which is a good thing because they're both dope. One of the best parts about this project is Big Ghost's production. It's so on point. And it sounds like he's genuinely done something slightly different with every project he's put out over the past year or so. And it sounds like his production style is revolving around the MCs he's working with, which I think is rare. In this day and age, you'll have a lot of producers that cook up tracks, send them out, and see who's the highest bidder. This project really reminds us of why in the golden era of hip-hop it was so important to have projects that were just a producer and an MC working together and working off each other. And it really pays off in this project because it's so cohesive, so tight, and has such a straightforward aesthetic and sound. It's awesome. Now, the style definitely stays in the lane of grimy sample-based production. You can hear similarities to Alchemist, once again, Rock Marciano, some others in that vein. The opening track actually reminded me of early RZA production, but maybe that's just me. I didn't sleep well. Now, while the production and the lyrics take on this Cocaine Beach aesthetic, you get some wavy and breezy sounds, never really veers too far from, dirty pavement, crack sidewalks of whatever urban locale your imagination wants to exist in when you were listening to this. Now, I'm doing something I don't like doing, which is I'm reviewing and talking about a record that literally just came out. It's kind of whack normally when people do that, especially when they listen to a new record online and they're like, #Logic, new classic, kill yourselves. But I'm not saying it's a classic. I'm not making hashtags. I'm saying it's a really good project by a really good rapper and a really good producer. There's no duds. There's some good features. We got Planet Asia on there. We have a friend of the podcast, Vic Spencer, on there. But let's play a little clip of one of the songs just so you can get a sense for it. The quality's not going to be the best, but whatever. Don't fucking judge me. This is free. It's the song called Cocaine City. I guess Cocaine City is where you go to the cocaine beach. There's probably a cocaine shoe repair, cocaine ice cream shop, cocaine pharmacy. That one's confusing. But either way, Cocaine Beach, Big Huss, Big Ghost. It's on SoundCloud. You can get it from Big Ghost website. There's literally no reason that you wouldn't listen to this. If you don't, that's your own fucking fault. Another thing, you've probably heard this track because it came out, a week or two ago at this point, something like that. But my friend, your friend, Vince Staples, of course, has a new record coming out later this month called Big Fish Theory. I'm excited about. You probably are too. A video and single came out for a track called Big Fish. And man, it's fun. The first single that came out from this record was Bag Back, which had almost like aggressive, clubby type sound to it. This one, like, the most ridiculous West Coast production. It sounds like something that YG would get really excited about that. I mean that in a positive way. And it's a really strong, confident showing for Vince. It has a cool video where he's hanging out on a boat. I often don't think of boats when I'm listening to rap music, but now because of that, I just want to get on a boat and listen to rap music. But yeah, it's a great track. And it's been interesting recently to see this contrast between Vince Staples' public appearances and interviews and like video stuff and what he's doing lyrically, because he's such a funny and sarcastic and smart dude, whether it be on Twitter and interviews or whatever it might be. Recently he got mad because he wants his fans to stop smoking weed in his shows because he has asthma and can't rap, and he expressed it in a really funny way. It's on Twitter. You can look it up. But it's such a fun contrast, that playfulness that he has in social media and interviews with the intensity he has lyrically, and the details he's always telling about, growing up in Long Beach and a lot of what he has seen there. So it's a interesting guy, a lot of sides of Vince Staples, and I am very optimistic that this record will be very strong. And it'll be good. We need some records coming out, because after a lot of hot projects early in 2017, we've hit a little bit of a dead zone now. So looking forward to the Vince Staples thing. If you haven't listened to Big Fish, but you probably have, but go do it. Last thing I wanted to talk about today, there was a cool article that came out today. Once again, June 1st. Sorry for being so, lifting up the veil and letting you know when this happens, not just in some weird atemporal ether, but at a place and a time with a person. My house, June 1st, me. But there's this article by Dan Hancock that's called Why British Hip Hop Might Just Save the Labour Party. And it's super interesting because for those of you that know, those of you who don't know, there's this dude, he's a 68, 69-year-old white guy named Jeremy Corbyn, who's a non-drinking vegetarian bike rider who makes his own jam and is real leftist and has kind of been an underdog in politics here. But one of the craziest things that happened is that the London hip-hop community, and I guess the British hip-hop community in general, has got behind him, which is the grime community. I'm sure some of you have listened to grime, some of you haven't. But the label Boy Better Know has gotten behind him. Stormzy has gotten behind him. A lot of really interesting artists. But it's been really interesting to see how this party of a lot of out-of-touch old white dudes has both been embraced by this music and has also been challenged and pulled in some interesting directions by this music. And it's a music that has a kind of contentious relationship with the mainstream in Britain. Obviously, it's a newer sound and a newer music, so it's not as mainstream, I guess with the exception of like Dizzy Rascal becoming a pop star for a little bit. But it's on the New York Times website, interesting to read, and always really cool to think about the way in which urban music has the capacity to have that political influence and play into a lot of what's going on in the world. So read that, and you can read that while you're listening to Cocaine Beach by Big Us and Big Ghost. And I would say maybe listen to it on the beach, but don't listen to it while doing cocaine because it's so obnoxious. Who have you ever been around on cocaine where you just thought, like, this is cool, I want to do this drug? I feel like it's a drug that you would only do if you didn't see someone on it first. Like, you could see someone that was high and just think, like, they look chill as fuck right now. I want to feel like that. Can I please have some? But I feel like anytime I've seen someone on cocaine, it's made me think that that's a thing I never wanted to do. Ever. But that has nothing to do with this. This Week in Hip Hop with Michael Burns on the Owls of Dawn podcast. I am out. I will catch you all soon. Listen to good music, think good things, eat good food. Back to Austin and Troy. Bye.
Here I go. The sky as smoothly as a bird, you scarcely realize you are traveling.
Alrighty then, thank you for that, Michael. Austin, you're a little closer to the actual 0 point here. Is Jez gonna win?
You know what, man? I'm not going to lie. I have some hope. It's possible. According to a relatively accurate poll, the YouGov poll, that the same metrics actually predicted that Brexit would win and that Trump would win. They had the Tory campaign 24 points ahead when the snap election was called. As of just a few days ago, it's only a 3-point margin now. And according to other estimates, maybe even less. So it's possible, brother. It could happen. I believe so. And I think on the last day of voter registration, something like 600,000 people registered to vote for Labor. So there's really been a huge Bernie Sanders type of groundswell that the Labor Party that is really catapulting the Labor Party in the polls. And they could win, dude. They could win. It's possible. And no BS. It is very possible that the hip-hop community, and in particular the grime community, and guys like Stormzy, could have a serious impact on getting seats to switch in certain constituencies from Tory to Labor. And I think there was a poster going around with Stormzy holding the microphone or something like that, and it said, and I can't remember where he's from. Let's say it's Hackney is his constituency that he's in, and it said something like, right now the difference in seats between Tory and Labor is like 169 votes. It was like your grandpop has more friends on Facebook. Get out there and vote. So I mean, that's a constituency that could switch from Tory to Labor. 170 votes or something like that could actually make a dent. And so it's very possible, and they're different. The way that they obviously do prime minister, they're a parliamentary democracy. So they run a little bit differently for people that are listening. They don't know that. So it's about voting for your local MP, your local minister of parliament, which is like your local representative in the United States. And then whichever party has the most representatives is the party, if they have a majority, is the party that then gets to have their head of that party become prime minister of the country. So it's possible, dude. It kind of reminds me of when Killer Mike joined forces with Bernie, like hip hop and democratic socialism, even though Corbyn's more actually left than Bernie is. But it seems that there's something that goes hand in hand. Who'd have thought, huh? Social justice and hip hop.
Yeah, it's so weird, man. I saw a picture of Corbyn on the cover of Kerrang magazine too. Pretty awkward looking.
Yeah, dude.
He looks like he belongs in a Fleetwood Mac tribute band.
It's so funny, man. People mock him based on his appearance. I don't really think, but I guess they did with Bernie too, huh?
Oh, of course.
It's so interesting. And we talked about this with Seth Abramson, a few weeks back about how it's not like they're trying to be cool, like they don't carry hot sauce in their pocket when they go talk to a hip hop radio station to try to seem relevant, like certain politicians that we know, or they don't try to
show up on Broad City
yeah.
in their pantsuits.
Yeah, exactly. They just there's an authenticity about them that is very, I don't know, it's infectious, And I love it. I would not be surprised if they went. And to be completely honest, Theresa May is an insufferable politician. She has no charisma. Her on-television personality is super snarky. She's always very uncomfortable and snide. She's always got this elitist distancing. And so I think that she's not going to be able to resonate with voters in the same way that at least Trump was able to kind of rouse somehow. He was able to rouse that support from a certain type of, the white middle-class voters or whatever, the disaffected. I'm not sure that May is able to do that. She doesn't have that cult of personality that will attract people. So people will simply vote for the Tories simply based on party strength and party name, and because it's comfortable and things like that. So I don't know, man. It's very possible. And the Labor Manifesto, people fucking love the manifesto that came out. So if you're listening, check out the Labor Manifesto. It's like free parking, aiming for free education, preservation of NHS, all the things that the electorate want to hear. So it could happen, dude.
I don't know, man. You know who else had a cult of personality like that? And it was gentle and kind and cared for the poor and all that kind of stuff?
Jesus?
It was Jesus. and look what happened to his political program.
Yeah.
I mean, massive failure. So, yeah, I'm not believing this is going to change much.
Yeah, well.
I think everybody actually wants their bitchy aunt to be their prime minister.
Oh, gosh. She is terrible. She really is. I watch interviews with her, and I wonder how it is that she would even become the head of the party. I mean, there is just no charisma in there. And maybe I'm just a sucker because I grew up in the LA world and I'm so attracted to the kind of like magnanimous character. I like to see that. Maybe I'm a sucker of the TV age, but she just doesn't have much appeal by way of her personality. And I don't know. I just think that a figurehead has to have something. Even though Jeremy Corbyn isn't like fucking George Clooney smooth or something like that, at least there's an authenticity that's attractive about him,
Yeah, totally. We talked about that same thing happening with Bernie too.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm also really excited to hear that we can actually officially say that Vic Spencer and Big Ghost are fans of the podcast. Is that a thing we can we put that on business cards?
Oh, serious?
Yeah, come on. Michael keeps saying that whenever he talks about them. He's like, they're fans of the podcast because they retweet and they like our stuff and they've engaged with us because Michael's covered their stuff in the past. So, I like that.
Yeah, it's legit.
That fuck you podcast money's going to come rolling in quick, right? All right. Well, so what you got going on for the next week? We're done with our 2-part. What are we going to be talking about next week?
I don't know. We might get back to something politically related.
Okay.
We'll see. Stay tuned.
Cool. Sounds good to me.
All right. So if you can find us on Twitter or Instagram at owls_@_Dawn, or drop us a 5-star review at iTunes, we'd really appreciate it.
Yep. And you can email us, owls@dawnpodcast@gmail.com.
Correct.
And other than that, don't be worried about the Paris Climate Accord stuff because a meteor is actually going to destroy the Earth before climate change actually does. So fuck it. Anyway, if you've seen Melancholia, that is our future. If you haven't seen Melancholia, see Melancholia, and then you'll realize that is our future. So nihilism, baby. It's coming.
Accelerate
Accelerate
that shit. Bring it on. Das Vidania, Amerikanski.